Hello everybody and welcome. This is the first Google Hangout session of the Pixel Project's fourth fall edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. My name is Anusha Kandasivam. I'm your moderator for this session. Through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 12 award-winning, best-selling authors to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for our celebrity male role model Pixel Reveal campaign. We aim to raise $1 million for the cause to end violence against women. Now, I'll be telling you a bit more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser a little later. We have lots and lots of exclusive author goodies. But meanwhile, if you want to find out more about the Pixel Project, you can go to www.thepixelproject.net. Okay, so today, for our very first Google Hangout session for this season, we have a very special guest. We have a live discussion and a Q&A session with Ken Liu. Ken is a winner of Nebula, Hugo, and World Fantasy Awards. He is the author of the Dandelion Dynasty series. It's a silk-punk epic fantasy series, and it includes books such as The Grace of Kings, The Wall of Storms, and there's a forthcoming third volume. He has also done a collection of short stories called The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories. They're great. Ken has very generously donated a unique goodie bundle to the stash of author goodies that we have set up on our Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So this bundle is available to US donors only. It consists of a signed and personalized first edition of The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, and a unique photo card of a location that inspired one of the stories in the collection. Now, this is the only one in existence. So all funds go towards the Pixel Project's Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign to help end violence against women. So please do give generously. I'll be telling you a little more about all the author goodies we have and how you can get your hands on them and how you can help the cause to donate. So stay tuned for that. But meanwhile, here is Ken. Hi, Ken.
Hello. Thank you, Anusha, and thank you to the Pixel Project and to all of you for tuning in. So before I do my reading, and we're going to follow that with the question and answer, I want to just say a few words about the goodies I've donated to the bundle and about the Pixel Project. Violence against women is an issue that's very close to my heart. It's a human rights issue. And a lot of my work deal with deconstructing toxic masculinity, which I think is an issue that's very much entwined with violence against women. And in fact, the story I'm going to read to you from The Regular, which is published as part of the upgraded anthology edited by Neil Clark back in 2014, is a story about deconstructing toxic masculinity and also very much about trying to end this horrible plague of violence against women. The picture card I donated to the Pixel Project is truly the only one in existence. It's from a photograph taken in Idaho, and it's inspired one of the stories in The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, the one that's called All the Flavors. If you haven't read the story, all you have to know is that it's a story devoted, inspired very much by the beauty of the landscape of Idaho. And it's in many ways a love song to the American West during the gold rush years. And that particular picture loudly inspired me to write it. Okay, so I'm going to start reading from The Regular. And you don't need to know much about it, but to set the scene, I will explain that this is a story about cybernetic enhancement. And at the beginning of the story, in the scene right before the one I'm about to read, a young woman has been brutally murdered by a man who is possibly after something in her. And we don't know what happened. All we know is that she was killed. And here is how the next scene starts. Because she's meticulous, Ruth Law runs through the numbers on the spreadsheet one last time. A summary called from credit card and bank statements and compares them against the numbers on the tax return. There's no doubt. The client's husband has been hiding money from the IRS, and more importantly, from the client. Summers in Boston can be brutally hot, but Ruth keeps the air conditioner off in her tiny office above a butcher shop in Chinatown. She's made a lot of people unhappy over the years, and there's no reason to make it any easier for them to sneak up on her with extra noise. She takes out her cell phone and starts to dial from memory. She never stores any numbers in the phone. She tells people it's for safety, but sometimes she wonders if it's a gesture, however small, of asserting her independence from machines. She stops at the sound of someone coming up the stairs. The footfalls are crisp and dainty, probably a woman, probably one with sensible heels. The scanner in the stairway hasn't been set off by the presence of a weapon, but that doesn't mean anything. She can kill without a gun or knife, and so can many others. Ruth deposits her phone noiselessly on the desk and reaches into her drawer to wrap the fingers of her right hand around the reassuring grip of the Glock 19. Only then does she turn slightly to the side to glance at the monitor showing the feed from the security camera mounted over the door. She feels very calm. The regulator is doing its job. There's no need to release any adrenaline yet. The visitor, in her 50s, is in a blue short-sleeve cardigan and white pants. She's looking around the door for a button for the doorbell. Her hair is so black that it must be dyed. She looks Chinese, holding her thin, petite body in a tight, nervous posture. Ruth relaxes and lets go of the gun to push the button to open the door. She stands up and holds out her hand. "What can I do for you?" "Are you Ruth Law, the private investigator?" In the woman's voice, Ruth hears traces of Mandarin rather than Cantonese or Fukienese. Probably not well connected in Chinatown then. "I am," she says. The woman looks surprised, as if Ruth isn't quite who she expected. "I'm Sarah Dean. I thought you were Chinese." As they shake hands, Ruth looks Sarah level in the eyes. They're about the same height, 5'4". Sarah looks well-maintained, but her fingers feel cold and thin like a bird's claw. "I'm half Chinese," Ruth says. "My father was Cantonese, second generation. My mother was white. My Cantonese is barely passable, and I never learned Mandarin." Sarah sits down in the armchair across from Ruth's desk. "But you have an office here." Ruth shrugs. "I've made my enemies. A lot of non-Chinese are uncomfortable moving around in Chinatown. They stick out. So it's safer for me to have my office here. Besides, you can't beat the rent." Sarah nods wearily. "I need your help with my daughter." She slides a claspable file across the desk toward her. Ruth sits down but doesn't reach for the file. "Tell me about her." Mona was working as an escort. A month ago, she was shot and killed in her apartment. The police think it's a robbery, maybe gang-related, and they have no leads. "It's a dangerous profession," Ruth says. "Did you know she was doing it?" "No, Mona had some difficulties after college, and we were never as close as I would have liked. We thought she was doing better the last 2 years, and she told us she had a job in publishing. It's difficult to know your child when you can't be the kind of mother she wants or needs. This country has different rules." Ruth nods at this, a familiar lament from immigrants. "I'm sorry for your loss, but it's unlikely I'll be able to do anything. Most of my cases now are about hidden assets, cheating spouses, insurance fraud, background checks, that sort of thing. Back when I was a member of the force, I did work in homicide, and I know the detectives are quite thorough in murder cases." "They're not!" Fury and desperation strain and crack Sarah's voice. "They think she's just a Chinese prostitute, and she died because she was stupid or got involved with a Chinese gang who wouldn't bother regular people. My husband is so ashamed that he won't even mention her name, but she's my daughter, and she's worth everything I have, and more." Ruth looks at her. She can feel the regulator suppressing her pity. Pity can lead to bad business decisions. Sarah goes on. "I keep on thinking there was some sign I should have seen, some way to tell her that I loved her that I didn't know. If only I had been a little less busy, a little more willing to pry and dig and to be hurt by her. I can't stand the way the detectives talk to me, like I'm wasting their time, but they don't want to show it." Ruth refrains from explaining that the police detectives are all fitted with regulators that should make the kind of prejudice she's implying impossible. The whole point of the regulator is to make police work under pressure more regular, less dependent on hunches. Oh, I'm sorry. My manuscript's jumped. Sorry. The whole point of the regulator is to make police work under pressure more regular, less dependent on hunches, emotional impulses, appeals to hidden prejudice. If the police are calling it a gang-related act of violence, there are likely good reasons for doing so. She says nothing because the woman in front of her is in pain, and guilt and love are so mixed up in her that she thinks paying to find her daughter's killer will make her feel better about being the kind of mother whose daughter would take up prostitution. Her angry, helpless posture reminds Ruth vaguely of something she tries to put out of her mind. Even if I find the killer, she says, it won't make you feel better. I don't care. Sarah tries to shrug, but the American gesture looks awkward and uncertain on her. My husband thinks I've gone crazy. I know how hopeless this is. You're not the first investigator I've spoken to. But a few suggested you because you're a woman and Chinese, and so maybe you care just enough to see something that you can't. She reaches into her purse and retrieves a check, sliding it across the table to put on top of the file. Here's $80,000. I'll pay double your daily rate and all expenses. If you use it up, I can get you more. Ruth stares at the check. She thinks about the sorry state of her finances. At 49, how many more chances will she have to set aside some money for when she'll be too old to do this? She still feels calm and completely rational, and she knows that the regulator is doing its job. She's sure that she's making her decision based on cost and benefits and a realistic evaluation of the case, and not because of the hunched over shoulders of Sarah Dane, looking like fragile twin dams holding back a flood of grief. Okay, she says. Okay. So that's the end of the excerpt.
That was great. We're having a tiny little technical problem because you are appearing very pixelated on the YouTube screen. So people can't really see your face. So I'm just going to switch the screen to me, see whether that makes a difference or not, and then I'll switch back.
Okay.
Okay, so meanwhile, guys who are watching, we're very sorry about the pixelation. Something's going on with Google Hangouts today. We're trying to fix it. Hopefully we can. Meanwhile, I'm sure you can see, I can hear Ken very clearly. I know the sound is good, so you can still ask your questions. You can type in your questions on in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. And Regina, our chat box moderator, will relay the questions to me. I'm also looking at the chat box, but she'll relay the questions to me in case I miss anything. And then I will read the question out to Ken, and he'll answer it. Okay, it seems that seems to be okay now. I mean, hopefully it's not just me. So I'm going to switch the screen back to Ken, and let's hope that he's clear.
That is very weird.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's never happened to us before. I'm so sorry, guys. But as long as the sound is good, you can still hear what Ken is saying.
All right.
Okay, it looks a bit better now. It's still slightly pixelated. Let's hope it. Well, okay, let's just get on with it. I'm gonna ask.
That's all right. Just you know what? People can go to my website and go to the About page, which will have pictures of me. They can look at the picture of me and just pretend this is a phone presentation.
A phone conversation, yeah. Okay. Well, I'll start with the first question. Now, you have so many amazing, strong female characters in your work. We just saw one in Ruth Law from this excerpt you read, and there are quite a few in your Dandelion Dynasty series. So my first question is a simple one. What or who inspires you to create your female characters?
Wow. Really? This is not a question I've ever been asked.
Really?
I guess so, you know, writers are really vampires because they sort of suck up the energy of everyone around them and then puts that good energy into their work. So I guess in a way that's kind of what I do. I mean, I've many relatives, grandparents, aunts, distant cousins who are all women who have taken life heads on and done amazing things. And so I'm sure shadows of them are in some of these characters, friends, and of course, students and teachers as well. But I think in a way, probably the most inspiring example for me really just comes from reading great literature. And if you read great literature, you see that the key to creating good, powerful characters really is to understand the flaws and the graces of all of us, and to not see people as a collection of stereotypes, but as the really complicated three-dimensional human beings that they are. And if you can see that in everyone, people around you, people you love, and people who you don't even get along with, then that's probably the best way to write strong, powerful characters. And I think that's probably where my women characters come from.
You know, there are so many sort of well-trodden gender stereotypes and tropes about women in fiction and in fantasy. And you're a fantasy writer. Work around these stereotypes to create female characters who are believable, empowered, who have their agency in dealing with the world around them, including situations that involve sexism, misogyny, violence against women and girls.
I guess I wouldn't say that I have some sort of magical answer to this. I've learned a lot from other writers, especially women writers, over the years. And I think something Kate Elliott, who I admire a great deal, once told me I found really helpful. I think something she said was, it's often the case that to create a strong, powerful, believable character, what matters isn't the amount of power she wields. Rather, what matters is what does she do with the power she does have, and whether she's doing things because she herself wants to do them, or because the plot requires her to do something, and you often and that's then misattributed to the world that she inhabits. In practice, what that means to me is, no matter how externally powerless someone is, based on the particular world that you placed him or her in, everybody maintains that absolute agency over their own fate in some sense. And if they don't have the ability to change external circumstances, they certainly have the ability to change their internal circumstances, and to maintain resistance and to push back against the powers that would reduce them down to non-thinking, mechanistic beings. And as long as we remember that, and that all of us are the heroes of our own narratives, you can write characters who are believable and strong, no matter what kind of powers they wield. And then I think it's often perhaps early on when I was writing, I perhaps sometimes made the mistake of thinking that in order for a character to be powerful, she actually has to wield a great deal of power. But that's not necessarily true. And in fact, that kind of writing tends to perpetuate an idea that to be powerless is somehow the person's own fault. That if they simply, were somehow magically will themselves into power, that would be the solution to everything. But that's not. That's in fact a very problematic kind of victim blaming. So I've learned over the years to see strength in a different way, as a matter of internal motivation, internal agency, rather than some kind of external sign of wielding a great deal of power. So it's a journey. I'm learning and being inspired by great writers like Kate, has been very helpful.
Yeah, that's very interesting actually. And it just made me think of something. So you said you're learning, and it is quite difficult to. Well, it's difficult for me at least. I don't know about you. You can tell me. To write a female character who is powerful in her own sense, without sort of without the other characters in that story reacting to her in a negative way. For example, what I like is it do you think it's important to portray a female character who can use what she has, whatever power she has, to get things done the way she wants to get done, without being labeled bossy or pushy or domineering or cold? Like maybe Ruth seems a bit cold, but you only say that because she's a woman. Do you find it difficult to do that?
I think writing good characters is difficult, period. And the problem you mentioned is, one of the consequences of the pervasive structural sexism that we have to deal with. I mean, we don't write in a vacuum. Whatever fantastical stories we write, they're still interpreted by readers who are steeped in these frameworks of power, of understanding power, of interpretation of power. That's very much premised on the toxic masculinity and patriarchal traditions that we're all wading through. So I guess my answer would be yes. I do find it incredibly difficult to do, but I think it's a struggle worth going through, and I think maybe one of the ways to solve that is to sort of avoid the trope of the single powerful woman who's somehow an exception. Because if we sort of perpetuate that framework, that setup, then we're always going to try to approach this problem from an angle of disadvantage. So maybe one of the things that I try to do is to not, have one single powerful woman character, but to have many women wielding power in different ways and different amounts of power. It's sort of more reflective of the reality of the world we're living in, as well as the better world that we're striving towards. We don't always have to be stuck in the artificial tropes that the traditions of fantasy have handed down to us. We can do something new. At least I think that's a worthwhile thing to explore, and I try to go in that direction and to make strides in that direction, to see if we can tell more interesting stories, more complex, but also stories that don't feel like you're always struggling against the very text you're trying to love.
Yeah, which kind of brings me to my next question. You mentioned Kate Elliott a few times, and we love her too. She's been a guest on Google Hangout guest, and we've had discussions with her as well. And I remember reading a discussion that you had with Kate Elliott, I think it was in December last year, about why people think depicting women in power is unrealistic.
Oh yeah.
And you mentioned, I think you had debated with yourself about whether to directly address the problem in your story, or sort of take it as a given that everybody thinks it's normal that female characters have power or drive plots forward on their own. And it seems to me that you took kind of a more studied approach in During Dynasty, because as the story unfolds, we see that there is an increase in the prominence of women characters and the depictions of power that they have in various levels of society. So did you do that deliberately as a reflection of how women's roles in a patriarchal society eventually evolve and change with need?
Well, so there are so many issues wrapped up in that question. I'll try to tackle them one at a time. The first question you have is about history, and then how we misuse history in the ways that the traditional fantasy genre is constructed. I mean, this whole idea that women wielding power is unrealistic is kind of preposterous, but it's very difficult to struggle against, because most people are actually not interested in history as it actually was. They're more interested in the stories about history that are being told. And of course, when it comes to matters of power, we have a tendency, we have multiple tendencies and biases that all work against us, with the result that sometimes trying to write stories that are actually realistic in the sense of being true and more reflective of historical power relations will end up reading to a contemporary reader as unrealistic. It's ironic, because we have a tendency to think that we are, in fact, more enlightened and completely different from the past, so that we unwittingly attribute to the past a bunch of our own prejudices, when in fact that may not have been the case. So you can write women in positions of power that are completely historically accurate, and it will read to some contemporary readers as though this is not possible because they're so steeped in the false narrative that they can't see it. So one of the questions is, do you fight against this tendency? Do you try to actually rescue history from the misreadings? Do you, when you're trying to write historically inspired fantasy, or do you not bother with that and just go on with it? And I don't know. I mean, in the Danzang Dynasty, which is historically inspired, I think I try to take a middle approach, which is to say that I wanted to, in some ways, rescue history from contemporary misunderstandings, and then I wanted to present women in positions of power in a way that doesn't make it seem like this is some sort of exceptional, crazy thing. But at the same time, I've got to address the fact that some readers will not view it as legitimate unless you do fight it. The other part of it is there is this question of, is it worthwhile to tell stories about change, or is it better to imagine worlds in which the change has already happened? I think a lot of writers do take the position that we keep on telling the story of change. Maybe it's time to try to imagine worlds in which we don't have sexism, and we don't have try to imagine a better world than the world we have. I mean, we are, after all, fantasists. Why can't we imagine a world that's actually better than the one we got, or the one that we're still working with? And I think that's a perfectly respectful position. I personally, though, because I think one of the most interesting things that I can do is to deconstruct toxic masculinity, I tend to think stories of change are interesting and quite powerful. And so in the Danzang Dynasty, I do try to tell a story of change. So the first book is a story about, in fact, this very patriarchal society that's coming apart at the seams. And the women, among other groups who have been marginalized from power, are working towards seizing power. And the second book is sort of showing one stage in that evolution towards a more just society. And the hope is that over the course of the entire trilogy, the idea of punk, of actually rebelling, of repurposing history and existing institutions to do something that they weren't designed to do, to achieve a new aesthetic and a new kind of politics, is going to be played out. So that was my thinking. I did want to tell a story of change, but I also wasn't interested in telling a story in which change is so hard that it basically doesn't happen. Yeah. That's not particularly interesting to me. I do want to tell a story of change, but I rather tell a story in which change actually succeeds.
Okay, that's great. Do you feel that you face any particular challenges as a male author when you write female characters?
I think so. I mean, again, I think the premise of all of this is that I think writing good characters is hard, period. No matter who it is you're trying to write and what kind of characters they are. But I do think when you're trying to write somebody whose lived experience is different from your own, you've got to be particularly careful. And so I do a lot of learning and do a lot of studying, and I try to do the best I can. And when I screw up, I learn from them and try to do better the next time. That's about, I think, my approach, and I hope that is, in fact, an approach that will lead to growth and to lead me to write better fiction for my readers.
Yeah, well, that's all anyone can hope for, to learn from your mistakes and to grow, right? We have a question from a fan, and she's been waiting very patiently while we've been talking. Brooke Cheng has asked, she did mention in the chat box that she's a new fan of yours and she hasn't read a lot of your stuff, but she's really getting into it. And she asked, how did you get into writing in the first place, and why did you choose to work on the fantasy genre in particular?
In terms of how I got into writing, it's kind of hard to say. I don't think I'm one of those people who, had a lifelong dream of being a writer or anything like that. I did always like telling stories as a kid, I remember, although who knows if it was the kind of thing where my grandparents told those stories to make me feel better. But I do have these vivid memories of being very enthralled really by stories and by making up stories for my friends and to entertain them. I didn't really get serious about writing until I was in college, and I started trying to figure out what kind of fiction I wanted to write and what sort of voice I wanted to develop. And I didn't really pick a genre. I think genre labels are very helpful for booksellers, and they may be helpful for some readers in terms of forming a framework for how to interpret a work, because when a work is specifically labeled to belong to a certain genre, it sets up certain expectations. If you know something is a mystery, you go in there with certain expectations about how the story will play out. If something's labeled a romance, you go in there with a different set of expectations and say, this is the kind of story I think it's going to be about, and this is how I'm going to try to interpret everything I read. I personally was not one of those readers who ever found that kind of thing helpful. And so genre labels never gripped me in any way that mattered. So I did not think I was writing science fiction or fantasy until I tried to figure out where to submit my stories. And people were telling me that you should try, science fiction and fantasy magazines. And so I said, okay, sure, I'll do that. So that's kind of how I drifted into it. It still is kind of funny for me to hear that people call me a certain kind of writer, because I don't think in genres, if that makes sense. It's always a little jarring to me because when I sit down to write a story, I don't think I'm going to write a fantasy or I'm going to write a science fiction story. In fact, it wasn't until and then the label that ended up getting stuck on it as epic fantasy was not something I set out to write. It was a label retroactively placed on the story I had already told. So that gives you a sense of how I sort of drifted into the genre without really knowing it. I'm very happy to end up where I am, because I'm lucky in that I found my readers. The big tragedy would be if I don't know what genre I write in, I never find my readers. The good thing is, despite the fact that I didn't set out to write genre, and these labels are placed on me only after the story was done, and it's often done by the publisher, not me. The good thing is I did actually find my readers, people who love the kind of stories that my stories are often classified as, actually like my stories, and so I can't be happier that things worked out that way. It would be horrible if I'm meant to be a romance writer and I got classified as a sci-fi writer and I can't find my readers. But it turns out I actually do write fantasy and science fiction, and that is in fact what people who like these things want to read. So that's one piece of it. The other piece is you were asking, why did I choose to write these particular kinds of stories? Well, I like stories that are about metaphors made real. So you can say that in some ways all literature is like that, because all fiction is really about the logic of metaphors. It's not about representing life as it is. It never is. Fiction is never about that, but rather about articulating some metaphorical logic of life and extracting that and trying to prioritize that logic of metaphors over the irreducibly random nature of actual life itself. I happen to like a particular kind of metaphor. I like metaphors that are about literalizing what is otherwise an abstract truth. So, for example, I'll give you one example. One way that I do this is in the Paper Menagerie, which is a story that a lot of people know me from. Um, there are these origami animals that come to life. And so people often ask, what is this about? I mean, that's really the only speculative element in the story. It's a very light kind of magic that's never explained. It's really magic realism. There's no explanation for why these animals are alive, and no attempt to create some sort of coherent magical system. It just is. It's part of the. Sorry. Can you still hear me?
Yes, yes. So you went out for a little bit, but it's back. Okay.
Are obviously about these stories are the animals are obviously meant to be a metaphor for the way uh, a mother's love animates and gives magic to ordinary things in our childhood. It's meant to be a metaphor for that way of seeing life. Except, in this particular story, that metaphor is literally true. It's not merely a way we talk about the childhood. It actually is the way the protagonist's childhood is lived. I like stories that take something that is otherwise metaphorical and abstract and makes it concrete and literally true. Because once you can start manipulating something that is literally true, that is otherwise just treated as an abstract metaphor, you can do all kinds of interesting things and come to a new understanding of the matter. It's kind of like how you can teach geometry by origami. And there's a difference in the way you learn geometry when you actually manipulate and a tangible representation of the geometric theories that you're trying to work with, as opposed to just working through the logical proof step by step. The ability to manipulate something with your hands, to think with your body, and to concretely reason with a representation of the idea is very powerful. And I think that's one of the things about fantasy that makes me so excited. It gives you a chance to work in concrete form with the thing that is otherwise only approachable through metaphor.
Yeah,
So that's my answer.
I see that. Okay, well, speaking of that and sort of speaking of that and relating to fans, how do you think authors can strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about sexism and gender-based violence and all of these issues and telling an engaging story without being preachy or pedantic?
So, I've never really understood this idea about pedantic stories being bad. I just don't understand it because all stories are pedantic. I mean, all stories are really there with a message. Uh, Stories that are deemed to be not political are really just stories that tell the message of the status quo is awesome. So that is their message. They don't seem particularly messagey simply because the message is so all pervasive and so harmonious with everything around you, with the structures of power that flow around you, with the linguistic performance acts that you're surrounded with, that you simply don't notice that they're trying to participate in this act of justifying the existing structures of power. So I don't actually think that there's often this advice being given about how you're not supposed to be pedantic and preaching your stories, and which I actually just disagree with, because I think whether a story is preachy or messagey depends entirely on what your internal politics are. That's really all there is to it. So I don't particularly care. And also, there's this notion that you're supposed to trust the reader and not be preachy. I hear this all the time in writing workshops, and I think that's also terrible advice. You can't trust the reader, and here's why. Um, Trusting the reader is very helpful if the message you're trying to tell in your story aligns with what the reader already believes. In that case, of course, you can trust the reader to get out of the story exactly what it is you meant to say. Um, there's this quote by Louis Manon that I think is awesome, which is something like, before a story can be unpacked for its meaning, it has to be packed first with the reader's expectations and assumptions. And I think that's super true. Readers never approach a text to interpret the text as is. Readers always fill it with background expectations and assumptions about the way the world works, and whatever she knows about the author, and suspects about the author before the reader starts unpacking the story and trying to understand it. So all stories are read under a set of contextual clues that are supplied by the reader. Given that to be the case, how can you possibly trust the reader unless the reader is basically 100% in agreement with you already? Because if you're trying to be quote unquote subtle and trying to sneak in your message, the only way to be sure that the reader can actually understand your message is if you're already perfectly in alignment. And that's just not the case in this globalized, multi-identity world that we live in. We don't have the same experiences. We don't have the same assumptions. We don't have the same cultural performances. We don't have the same kind of understanding of what it means to express love and how to express love and how to express agreement and what is good and what is bad. All these things we're not, in fact, in agreement with. So you can't possibly trust the reader, because to trust the reader in that sense is to disrespect the reader, because you're assuming that what you know about the world is universal to all readers. And that is a deep act of disrespect. And so I don't agree with that approach at all. And so I guess my point about all this is I don't think you should care about writing pedantic or preachy stories. You should write stories that feel true to you. You should feel stories that are resonant with you, because you're the only reader that you actually know. And you don't need to trust the reader. The reader will have to learn to trust you. That is how that works. So yeah, I know that was a bit of a rant, but that is a thing that I care about a great deal. I hear a lot about these anti-pedantic, anti-preachy stories, and they're almost inevitably coming from the perspective of, I'm comfortable with my politics. Why do you want to tell me I'm wrong?
Yeah, I get what you mean. I do. We have another question from a fan, from David Holden, who says, is there any is there any chance at a centillion novel in the future? The more tech news I read, the more I'm afraid I'm going to wake up as a Luddite. Thanks for contributing to that.
Ha! I don't know what to say other than that. I thank you, first of all, but also, we do live in a terrifying world. I don't know what to say. I mean, I think a lot of times the sort of things I'm worried about, seem to other people like I'm just some sort of paranoid conspiracy theorist, and I really don't think I am. I mean, I think we are living in a very dangerous time where very powerful technology platform owners are controlling more and more of our online lives as well as offline lives. It's not people are always like, well, you're just worried about seeing ads. What's the big deal? It's not. It's not about advertising. It's not about this abstract idea of privacy. It's not about any of those things that terrifies me. It's the idea that so much power has been concentrated in the hands of so few. We have just a few very large companies, like Tencent, like Google, like Amazon, like Facebook, that in essence, yes, that in essence,
They're slowly taking over the world, really.
They really are. There are a few of these companies that are essentially controlling so much of our lives, and we act like everything is okay because it's a contractual relationship. What's the big deal? Well, here's the big deal. The big deal is that these owners are become the single choke points of our digital lives and as well as offline lives. If one of these companies decides to terminate service with you, you have no recourse. It's not like you're a citizen of some country and you have rights. You have no rights. These platform owners their relationship to you is that of a feudal lord to a serf. If the lord wants to kick you off its land, that's the end of it. You have no recourse. We think the internet is, perfectly free to route around censorship and all the rest of it. But in reality, there are just a few choke points held by these platform owners that basically determine everything. And this trend of concentration of power is growing worse, not better. And we are, in this position where all of us are basically little serfs, laboring in the digital feudal realm created by these great platform owners.
So are you going to be writing a centennial novel about all of this?
I may eventually write some sort of novel that may explore some of these ideas.
Okay.
No promises, but yes, maybe.
You kind of, what you were saying kind of reminded me of, those alien movies with Weyland Yutani, which basically owns the world. Like this big corporation, this conglomerate. Yeah, that's the kind of world you seem to think we're going towards.
I am very terrified of the fact that so much power is being concentrated in just a few places, and these places are not. They're not public institutions. They're not public institutions subject to any kind of democratic oversight. These are private actors who are feudal lords who have been granted enormous power because of this artificial division between what is public and private and what is contractual versus what is, otherwise political. It's deeply, deeply disturbing.
Okay, well, let's move the conversation back sort of to what we were talking about earlier. And you did mention something about the status quo and people being sort of satisfied with their own little worlds and not, not being happy with change, I guess. So my next question is about geek culture, including science fiction and fantasy culture, which has had its share of critics saying that it's still too male-dominated, despite there being a rising number of prominent and well-respected and well-known female authors. So what do you think should be done or can be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's books or gaming or comics or more welcoming for women and girls?
I think this is one of those problems that has no single simple solution. I think it requires concerted effort from all directions. I mean, on the one hand, we need to recognize the fact that that fandom has never been the exclusive domain of any one group. People of color and women and other marginalized groups have always been part of fandom. They have always been important parts of fandom, important parts of the creators, as well as the fans and those who have sustained the very life of the creators themselves. At the same time, though, we also can't ignore the problem that you're actually pointing out, which is that the narrative that this is in fact the exclusive clubhouse of a certain group and that others are not welcome constantly gets trotted out, and there are those who constantly say, why do you want to mess with just plain old adventure and plain old fun? Why talk about all this stuff? Let's just keep on doing what we've always been doing, and let's go on.
And I know exactly who you're talking about who says that.
Right. So if you wanna, when you're faced with that kind of push, I mean, I personally think, I mean, there are a variety of responses you can have to this. You can argue with them, you can fight with them, you can try to create new spaces that are more welcoming, you can try to transform existing spaces so they're more welcoming. You can go in there and do all of these things. The kind of response I personally think is most relevant for me really is to try to just amplify the voices of those who are traditionally underrepresented and marginalized and pushed out, and try to magnify those who would criticize the state of fandom and to point out that these criticisms are in fact right. They're pointing out issues, and we should be facing these issues and trying to address them rather than trying to pretend that everything's okay and trying to shut up those who would criticize. Um, I think ultimately the point of this, though, is to, in fact, celebrate our joint love for science fiction and fantasy as a body of work, as a way of thinking, as a way of contemplating the future as well as the present. Only by making the space actually welcoming and actually comfortable and actually home for everybody who wants to be there can we actually sit down and appreciate and celebrate and create without these problematic aspects. And I'm somewhat pessimistic as a tendency, and so I think this is a struggle that's going to have to go on for a while, and we're going to have to keep on going at it. I don't think it's the sort of thing that will be solved overnight. But I am confident that it is the right thing to do, and we need to keep on pushing. And you know, my feeling is that things are going to get slightly better every single year. And maybe when you're in the middle of it, it's very hard to see the change. But if you compare things at half-decade or decade-long intervals, there definitely is an improvement.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few times that you write sort of to comment on toxic masculinity. Is that one of the reasons you do that? Is it because you want to bring about this change and you sort of want to challenge the status quo?
Yeah, I do. I think toxic masculinity is a threat to human rights of all. It's not just as I mean, toxic masculinity threatens not just those who are not male and who are not traditionally in power. It in fact is a destructive force for everybody involved, including those who do wield power and enjoy its advantages under the current system. And because it is in fact a terrible cancerous development of our civilization, I think we do need to deconstruct it and to change it. I mean, it's sort of like for years and years and years, absolute monarchy and absolute power is seen as the norm. And so those who would try to challenge it are seen as, crazy people. Why would you challenge this? This is the way the world is. It will always be that way. I think sometimes those who defend toxic masculinity sound similarly. They're like, well, boys will be boys. This is the way men have always been. What are you talking about? And that's just not true. So I don't believe in that kind of fatalism. And I think it is worthwhile to try to challenge toxic masculinity and try to deconstruct it and to make the world better for everyone. And so, insofar as my fiction can serve in some manner to that fight, I think it's worthwhile. Also, toxic masculinity isn't some sort of independent force. It is tied up inextricably with colonialism, with all kinds of other systems of oppression, with racism. And fighting, deconstructing toxic masculinity has a way of helping against all of these fights as well. Everything is connected. It's not just about one thing. It is in fact about all forms of oppression, which take as their model and their template this part and parcel of the same dynamic. And so fighting against one of them is fighting against all of them.
Yeah. Okay. Now, parents play a very influential role in young people's lives. They are role models, and you're a father of two little girls yourself. What do you think parents can do to help prevent violence against women? Like, prevent violence against women and girls in future generations, and get boys involved in helping, change the world as well.
Well, it's as I said, violence against women is a human rights problem, and so everybody is involved and needs to be involved. When it comes to boys, I think a fundamental part of our effort needs to be directed, into obvious. There are obvious suggestions of instilling a fundamental respect for women, fundamental respect for girls, and absolute adherence to the equality of the sexes, and respect for gender diversity, as part of the human condition. But at the same time, I do think that it's very important to teach boys also to understand the perspective of privilege and of power, of what it means to benefit from an unequal system, so that they can in fact see the ways in which the narrative they're in is not a narrative that is universal, natural, quote unquote natural, or deserved. I think one of the things that happens to children is whatever they grow up with, as they become acculturated to, becomes the norm. They end up viewing that as universal, as the way things ought to be. And so it's very important for us to try to instill a critical attitude early on in all kids, but in the case of boys in particular, in order so that they can see their own privileges. It's easier as a person who is oppressed and who is in a marginalized position to see the inequality of the system. But it's much harder for someone who benefits from the privileges and the inequalities of that system to see that. And so teaching boys that critical perspective so they can in fact see the ways in which the narrative is unfair and destructive can be particularly helpful, I think.
Okay. Okay, so we're almost at the end of an hour, so I'm gonna ask the last question, since nobody else is asking any more questions on the fan side. You, Ken, have been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work. Can you tell us why you support the cause to end violence against women, and how you think authors like yourself can best support efforts to kick off social change to end violence against women?
So, as I've mentioned several times, the cause of ending violence against women is very important to me because I view it as part and parcel of the fundamental guarantee of human rights. If we cannot stop violence against women, then this most fundamental aspect of the promise of universal human rights has not been fulfilled. It's not just about a particular dictator or somebody who slaughters millions. That is, the kind of human rights abuses that we talk about the most. But everyday violence against women is a problem of equal dimension and affects also millions, hundreds of millions, if not, in fact, billions around the globe. And we do absolutely need to strive to solve this lingering human rights abuse. And in terms of what authors like me can do, I think honestly, probably one of the most helpful things we can do is to try to tell better stories. There's a long-standing problem within fiction of simply replicating social narratives in the service of trying to tell a quote-unquote entertaining story. So, it's easy for a lot of films, for example. I'll take popular entertainment as an example. It's very popular and common to see a lot of popular films using the trope of using the death of a loved female as the motivation for some male character's transformation and mission of vengeance. That kind of narrative, one replicated hundreds of times and constantly in media, basically tells a story that this is the way the world is. There is no change, and in fact that violence against women is meaningful. It is a thing that can motivate men to do good things. I think that's obviously a very destructive narrative, a narrative that we should not in fact be perpetuating. As I mentioned earlier, fiction is never really about reality. It's fiction is not, in fact, about reality. It's about visions of reality. It's about metaphors about reality. It's about potentials of reality and where you want reality to be. So we shouldn't excuse these narratives by saying that's the way things are. That in fact is itself a problematic narrative. And so I think writers can in fact do more for the cause simply by trying to tell better stories that are more reflective of where we want to be, of a better world, of a world that isn't hopelessly trapped in its own unequal power narratives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ken. We had a really interesting discussion, and thank you everybody who asked questions and all the viewers who. I'm so sorry again for the pixelations, but you could hear what Ken was saying, so that's fine. And Ken, you have some announcements for the fans.
Oh yeah, I will just make a quick announcement. I wrote a Star Wars book called The Legends of Luke Skywalker. That's part of the Journey to the Last Jedi project from Disney. This is a book that I'm very proud of, that I love. I'm a lifelong Star Wars fan, and the hope is, the story, this book is a book that will be that will feel lovely and just effervescently giddy to longtime fans, but also welcoming to new fans who did not grow up on those movies and then who are coming into fandom only with the release of the new trilogy. I'm hoping that this is a book that will appeal to both groups and to also future generations who will come to discover these movies as they grow up. And this is a book. It's not out yet. The Legends of Luke Skywalker is going to be out October 30th. So stay tuned and grab it when it comes out. Also, the other announcement I wanted to make is that the second book in my Dandelion Dynasty series called The Wall of Storms, which sort of continues the story of revolution that's begun in the Grace of Kings. This is a story about rebuilding, about change enacted. That's out now in trade paperback. So if you have a chance and you haven't picked up the hardcover yet, here's your chance to pick up the trade paperback.
And I want to ask this for the fans. When's the third book?
So I'm working on the third book right now. It has no title because I don't want to announce the title only to have to change it later. But it is being worked on, and I'm pretty excited about it. It's a hard book to write because I'm trying to solve. As I mentioned earlier, I want to talk about reconstruction of narratives, and this is an ambitious book. It's the hardest book I've ever had to write. But I think it's coming along nicely, and I'm excited about the new inventions and the new technologies and the new ideas and the new characters that I'll be introducing to readers. So stay tuned, and as soon as I have news to announce, I will.
Oh, that's so exciting. I can't wait either.
Thank you.
Okay, so I promised to tell you guys about the author goodies that we were giving away. I mean, how to get your hands on author goodies that we were giving away. So as I mentioned earlier, Ken has very generously donated a very cool goodie bundle, which consists of one signed and personalized copy of a first edition copy of The Paper Menagerie and Other Stories, plus a unique photo card of a location that inspired one of the stories in the collection. And as Ken said earlier, this is the only photo of this place in existence in the world. So you can get your hands on it. And besides Ken's stuff, we also have 20 more author goodies from other authors such as Kristen Britton, Irving Tchaikovsky, Genevieve Valentine, Isaac Marion, so many more. And we will be releasing the goodies in batches. So if you guys check back on Fridays, you can see the new perks going up. And please do note that some of the goodies are for US donors only. Ken's goodie bundle is for US donors only, but some are for worldwide donors. So please do check before you select. Okay, so here's how you're gonna do it. I'm gonna share a little slide. I hope you guys can see this. Here it is. Can you see it, Ken?
Yes, I can.
Okay. So here we have, oops, my notes. Here we have the website that you can go to. So all you have to do is donate is go to our Rally Up page, which is is.gd/r4p Rally Up 2017. And all the awesome videos are there, and you can just go pick the ones you want, such as Ken's, which is really amazing. If you want to learn more about our Read for Pixel sessions that are coming up, please go to is.gd/read4pixel. And please do give generously. All funds go towards raising $1 million for the Pixel Project Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign to help end violence against women. And if you want to find out more about the campaign and how you can help to end violence against women, please do visit the Pixel Project website. We're at www.thepixelproject.net. Okay, so all that's left to do is to say thank you so much to Ken. Thank you so much, Ken, for being with us. And again,
And
I
thank you so
apologize
much
for
for
the
having me.
we had a really great discussion. It was really eye-opening and enlightening. And yeah, I hope we can work together again. So thank you, everybody, and good day or good night wherever you are in the world. We hope to see you again.
All
Bye.
right. Thank you, Nisha. Thank you.